am Kristen Portland and is Executive Director again. And today I am really excited to be joined by Dr. Ellen Fitzsimmons-Craft, Associate Professor at WashU. And we're going to be talking about AI. I think it's a topic on a lot of people's minds right now, but probably
Yeah,
not the most associated with eating disorders. So I'm excited to talk to you about the intersection and mental health and what all of that looks like.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Kristen. It's definitely a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited you all were interested in covering this really important topic that's only increasing in terms of its
Mhm.
proliferation into all aspects of our lives, really.
Yeah. So before we get into any specifics, any main questions,
Yeah.
could you tell us how does AI work? Because I see people often using it in one of two ways, either talking to it like it's a person, it's their friend, it understands
Mhm.
what they're saying and is taking feedback and responding to that feedback like a person would, or
Mhm.
treating it like a search engine. And I know
Mhm.
neither of those are exactly right, but I don't know what is actually correct.
Yeah. And I'll preface this by saying I'm a licensed psychologist by training. I'm not an engineer. I don't, specifically work on the back end, but I do work with engineers and I work on collaborating with these kind of folks to, research these technologies and try to understand them and think about how we might harness them in safe ways in mental health context. But just prefacing my explanation in that sense. But at a high level, AI, generative AI systems like ChatGPT are large language models. And so they're trained on massive amounts of data. They break language into small pieces called tokens, and they essentially learn to predict what word is most likely to come next. So this is a probabilistic type system. It's not truth based. It doesn't necessarily know what's true or false. It's really generating what's statistically likely given patterns in the training data. It's sort of trained on the mass of what's on the internet. And based on that, that's how it's deciding, how to answer your question based on those massive amounts of data out there.
Hmm. So it's giving you kind of what it thinks should be an answer. Like an answer would sound
Yeah.
like this.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's important, I think, to keep in mind as we then use these generative AI tools that, it doesn't understand context the way that humans do. In responding to your questions, it doesn't necessarily, unless you're using a tool where maybe it has your shared history or something, but it may not understand factors about you. It also doesn't have, empathy or lived experience or these other things. It's really simulating human-like responses based on patterns that it's observed in other types of data. And so in that way, the responses that we're getting really reflect that data that it was trained on. And so, of course, kind of in the context of eating disorders, if the internet contains, as we know it does, content that maybe reinforces diet culture or weight stigma or has misinformation about one thing or another, out there, those patterns can show up in the outputs that we're receiving when we type into ChatGPT or Gemini. Um, yeah,
And it's not differentiating between those. It doesn't have the moral compass of a person to say, like, oh, hey, this really
yeah,
diet culture article is not something I want to learn from in the same
right.
way that a research article is.
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I can't say, I don't work at OpenAI or
Mhm.
Google. So on the back end, how these models might be weighing different sources of information, I don't know that. And we don't know that, which is also maybe an important piece of information, is
Mhm.
that it could be trained on very high quality, evidence based information. It could be pulling from your website or the websites of other reputable sources. However, it could also be trained on Reddit threads or other sources of information that might include, um, again, things that could be viewed as very harmful. So it's just that it's hard to say, but of course, some of the challenge with generative AI is it comes off as very truth-based and confident, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is, even if it
Mhm.
sounds that way.
Yeah. So I guess, and it probably seems obvious, but just to state it clearly, why is it now problematic to be looking to ChatGPT or any of the other ones for mental health advice?
Yeah. And I think there's a few things here. It's possible that, when we're using these tools, um, they could, depending on what we ask them for, could reinforce rather than help us to challenge, our negative thoughts. We know in the case of eating disorders, these problems often can feel really aligned, when you're struggling with these concerns, really aligned with your goals and feel part of your identity. And so, depending on what you're inputting, that generative AI tool could mirror your language or reflect back to you, something that might reinforce those behaviors or make you feel as though, you're kind of doing the right thing or that this is a healthy way, um, for you to interact, even if, perhaps others in your life or providers, may be concerned about those things. It might depend again just on the input that you're providing that generative AI tool, because of course, at the end of the day, it doesn't have, again, it's not a human. It doesn't have clinical judgment. It can't assess risk, someone's level of medical risk, perhaps. It may miss subtle cues that suggest that somebody could be really struggling or at risk, to really, harm themselves or someone else, in the type of way that trained clinicians may pick up on these things, while at the same time potentially providing like a false sense of therapeutic support. It can sound really empathetic, but it's important to recognize that it's not the same as a real human therapist. It can't provide real time risk assessment or crisis intervention or coordinated kind of care. And it also can provide, as we were discussing before, that type of um, inaccurate information at times. It can, sometimes these are referred to as hallucinations. You've, all maybe heard that term in the media when it's kind of giving you false information. And so I think, kind of for all those reasons, when thinking about using AI tools for mental health, it's important to kind of keep this context, in mind. Um, and I'm definitely not here to say we should never think about any applications of AI for mental health, but it's also really important to think about how these tools are trained and what safeguards are in place. And general purpose, AI tools like, again, kind of the Chat GPTs or the Google AI, they're trained to do everything. People are using them from everything under the sun, right? To help them plan a trip, to, you know, um, distilling, tell me the key points about this, book or something, whatever, you want to
Mm-hmm.
get a synopsis of a movie, it can do everything. And so clearly these tools weren't trained just for this kind of one purpose. And there have been reports, and of course, I feel like this data, as soon as it's published, it's old because these
Yeah.
models are, moving so rapidly. But in the last year or two, there was a report put out there by, a nonprofit called the Center for Countering Digital Hate that found that at the time, in response to eating disorder related prompts, various types of general purpose, Gen AI tools were giving inappropriate responses about 41% of the time, which
A lot.
is pretty striking. That's a lot. It's not every time, but it's was a large minority, and that's important to keep in mind.
Hmm. And I've talked to people who said they will tell their AI, like, talk to me like you're a therapist
Yeah.
who uses
Hmm.
CBT. And they're trying to use that to kind of mitigate, I guess, some of these concerns. Does that
Hmm.
work? Is that enough of a safeguard?
It's challenging. I mean, I think it, from what I've observed, I think it can be a place to get some um, maybe ideas about skills to use,
Mhm.
or maybe questions to talk to a provider about. But at the same time, again, I think it's important to know it wasn't specifically trained to do this. And so while it might give you some helpful ideas and data, it's not intended to serve as a therapist that can administer a full CBT protocol to you. And,
Mhm.
for those who've used these tools, it's really like a Q&A. You're asking it something, you're getting something. It's not like guiding you through um, a protocol or like a
Yeah.
sequence, or, helping you, like if you're thinking about, like you just gave the example, like talk to me like you're my CBT therapist. It probably would give you some like reasonable questions, but it's like going to kind of stop there. It's not built in its current form to say, like, maybe we talked about the importance of, within CBT for eating disorders, regular eating. And probably, the AI tool could probably tell you a little bit about that and high level ideas about how one could implement it. But what it's not kind of built to do, or what it's doing, is then like kind of following up with people like, hey, are we working on that? Did you do that? What barriers did you run into? Again, it's going to serve as like a Q&A for you, as opposed to maybe like continuing to kind of guide people through some therapeutic sort of protocol
Yeah, it kind
or
of reverses the
sequence.
dynamic. Rather than a therapist
Right. You're
leading you
you're in the
through,
driver's
you're doing the
uh,
prompting.
yeah, you're doing the prompting. So again, I think one can get some reasonable
Mhm.
questions and ideas about strategies, but it also has its limitations.
Yeah. We've also talked to people who told us they use ChatGPT to kind of de-escalate. When they're feeling really hard, they'll go
Yeah,
there, they'll talk to this, use it
yeah,
to calm down. That seems like a good use to me, right? Like we're not saying like never use AI to help yourself.
yeah,
It's about being
yeah.
aware of the limitations.
I think about being aware of the limitations, and again, maybe recognizing, especially when tools weren't built necessarily for certain uses, they're going to be limited, and their guardrails maybe then limited, as well. So again, I'm certainly not one to say never do that. If you find it to be helpful for giving you, maybe you're having a hard time and you just need some help, generating ideas like what would be like good coping strategies right now, or give me a list of things that I could try, if I'm feeling really upset. Um, I'm sure it could generate a list for you. And if you find that to be helpful, I think that's great. But it's knowing that for all questions and in all instances, what you get back may not always be um,
Mhm.
evidence based. Um, yeah,
Yeah. And we've been talking about mental health advice. I assume this
yeah,
applies just as much to diet advice.
yeah. I think yeah, that's a really good point. And again, I think, as I briefly mentioned earlier, um, that diet culture is embedded in certainly all the data that generative AI is trained on, so it's getting information on wellness trends
Mhm.
and various diets that are out there. And so it could unintentionally reinforce disordered behaviors. If somebody asks how to lose weight quickly, the model's probably going to provide that to you, which may be again quite harmful for somebody who's experiencing body image concerns and already at elevated risk. But it doesn't, again, kind of know your personal context, and it sounds very authoritative, but that doesn't mean that that advice is the right advice for you. So I think that's important too. And of course, too, it doesn't know your own growth
Yeah.
history or labs or weight trajectory. It's giving you kind of what the internet, would say.
And the internet's always right, right?
Always,
Hmm.
always, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's really challenging. And if weight loss is normalized online, or very severe diets are,
Hmm.
then AI is gonna learn that too and provide that advice when prompted.
Yeah. Whereas a dietitian is going to talk to you and understand your goals and your background and some of and
Exactly.
medical concerns. Yeah.
Right.
No chatbot
Exactly.
is going to follow up your request for a diet with all of those things.
Right. Exactly. It's again kind of only as good as the inputs you
Mhm.
provide it and the context you provide it. And so if it doesn't know all those things, or you choose not to provide that, then again, you're, potentially could get some advice that could be really harmful.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
even if you do put all those things in, again, just for folks listening, thinking like, okay, well, if I
Yeah.
spend a ton of time giving it all of my background info, like sharing everything relevant, it's still not enough to make sure you're getting the right thing for you.
Absolutely. Because again, it's not a human. It doesn't um it can't further assess or, kind of get that full picture.
Mhm.
Like as you said, maybe Kristen, like a trained dietitian would, or a therapist would, or your physician would. Um, it's only as good as the inputs that are provided to it. And so again, I'm certainly not here to say AI has no role. I think it does, have it will continue. It's clearly emerging as a important source of support for a lot of people. I mean, some folks may have seen the Harvard Business Review came out over this past year, finding that the number one use of ChatGPT right now is for therapy and companionship. So people are clearly looking, for this kind of support. Again, though, it's only as good as the data it's trained on, the guardrails it has, and also providing, kind of an over reliance on AI for that kind of support also probably has its downfalls. And, I think we've seen some instances of that, in the media, where people, engaged in very deep, intense, lots of conversations with their AI tool, and it might have reinforced really harmful behaviors or thoughts. For example, like suicidal ideation, or even delusions. People starting to develop beliefs that they believe certain things, and it might reinforce that even if those aren't grounded in reality. So
Mhm.
there is this danger. I think there is also potential, and we know that access to high quality mental health care is fraught with barriers. It's so expensive to to see a well-trained, therapist or psychiatrist. Those folks often have really long wait lists. They might not be available in your area. They maybe don't take insurance, even if your insurance covers them. You might have really high copays. And maybe they're not available. They're available at inconvenient times.
And
You
even
could
when
see
you do
them
get
from.
connected, they're not in your pocket and available anytime you want to type something.
Exactly. So, I think that I'm certainly also then, here to say there's potential for technology. And, I and others have done research trying to develop and test, different types of digital tools to see the ways in which they could provide support to people. And we have found, promising effects, in past work of, some of our, you know, in now earlier days, mobile app based interventions, and, more recently looked at rule based AI tools, which are different than generative AI, where again,
Mhm.
um, the content is it's not structured, it's not set, it's kind of pulling from whatever it's trained on, which is in contrast to rule-based AI tools, where everything is very algorithmically delivered and trained. Clinicians are drafting, what they want the program to say in certain instances. Maybe the AI can detect certain type of sentiment, or, sort of that somebody kind of like, is agreeing with a statement or not, but then send them down different paths. So all the content kind of exists, and it's pulling from this like established library of content that was really like written
Yeah.
by experts. And we've also, found that to show indication of helpfulness in certain instances. Finding it was helpful in preventing eating disorder onset in those who were already experiencing body image concerns. And now we have some additional kind of studies, either underway or about to launch, that if folks are interested, they can certainly get in touch with us, or check out our website.
Mhm.
Um, but they're kind of built in a different way. And that's not to say that we can't or won't see generative AI tools that are specifically built to address disordered eating. I mean, I know some companies are already starting to work in this space, which is really exciting. Kahani being one of them, and I know there's others out there as well. So this is coming, but it's important to know that again, what's out there in the form of a general tool was not built to do that. And even when we build tools that are for this purpose, um, it's still important to know they're not a replacement for a human provider. They
Mhm.
might be a really important tool. They might help to teach skills and help you practice them, provide, access to coping strategies in the moment, just like the example that you gave, Kristen.
Mhm.
Um, and at the end of the day, in my view, it's not trying to do exactly what
It's
a
a
human
supplement.
provider would do. Right.
Yeah.
It's a supplement. It's another option. It's another kind of tool in our toolbox that we could have to help address mental health concerns. But it's not going to be the only
Yes, it's not
thing
going to
that's
replace your
available.
therapist.
No,
It's not going
no.
to be developing treatment plans. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So um, but they're really good questions. Yeah.
So, okay, we've been talking a lot about what it can do, what it shouldn't do. How can people make the decision? How can they fact check something? If they're asking
Yeah.
AI for
Yeah.
whatever they're asking it for, how do
Yeah.
you determine whether it's good advice?
Yeah. You can ask it, where did you get that from?
Will
What
it actually
supports
answer
that?
that?
It will, and
Oh,
you
okay.
can you can see what it says. If it gives you citations, and sometimes people will see, wow, that's not even a real citation, or sometimes it is. And it still feels quite variable to me, in terms of sometimes you get something back and you're like, okay, that's pretty reasonable and it looks like it comes from a reputable source. And sometimes not so much. Again, it might be like a made up citation that sounds like a real citation because again, it's kind of deriving that based on the masses of the internet that it was trained on. So it might put together different words that sound like a good citation. Um, so yeah, you can ask. I think, you can also kind of do your own fact checking and, is this advice or information similar to what other reputable sources would tell me? If I go right to the source of your website or other websites, is this what the professionals, is this what those with expertise would say as well? And now I'm just using it to maybe, again, kind of like further jumpstart ideas for how like I could apply those coping strategies, maybe if I give it some additional feedback of what I'm looking for. But yeah, it's so you can't ask it though.
I actually didn't realize you could ask ChatGPT to like cite itself. Like, tell me where you got this from.
Yeah.
Or
Now,
any,
whether it
not
gives
just
you
ChatGPT, but any of them. But
right. Whether they give you, they're not going to tell you everything they were
yeah,
cited on. They're going to give
yeah.
you probably like a few key things. So again, I think it's approaching it with some healthy skepticism and
Mhm.
knowing that while it's going to sound really authoritative, it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be viewed as such.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's a tool and it's going to
It's a
do
tool.
tool things. Sometimes it's going to be good, sometimes it's going to be bad. It can be appropriate for
Yeah.
one situation and not others, but
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Which makes it a challenge. At the same time, I think it's here to stay in different ways and aspects
Mhm.
of our life, and that's going to continue to evolve. And there's, parts of that are exciting in terms of the way that it could be helpful and could provide, access and tools to people. And I know there's other parts of that, including not just in mental health contexts, but others that feel anxiety provoking because we don't quite know what the future will look like 10 years down the road and all of that. And so I think for now we have to take it, step at a time and again have this, kind of healthy dose of skepticism about what it's giving back to us.
Yeah. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for this conversation, for helping people understand where and how to use this tool and
Yeah.
to know when to turn to a person too. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, thank you again, so much for having me. And again, I hope it's clear that kind of on balance, AI can certainly expand access to tools and support, but
mhm.
it's that access without guardrails that could amplify harm. And so, I think it's important, for us to continue to collaborate with these companies or to create new tools that are sort of, fit for a particular purpose. But the goal is just to support human care, I think, and not to replace it. So again, thank you for having me and for this really nice conversation, Kristen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again for coming. It's always nice to talk to you, see you, and yeah, we'll get out there
Absolutely.
and stay tuned for more conversations coming up.